Good morning, and thank you very much for coming to this session. Exams are usually not something that we can get very excited about. In principle, they're not something which involves us feeling very thrilled and excited about things, but actually exams are absolutely key to many aspects of our work. And I'm going to talk generally about exams, and I'm going to bring in the idea of a new British Council exam, which is we are going to start using probably from January on. Nowadays, with the increase in mobility, there's a huge increase in mobility. You obviously know about this, with students traveling a lot more in Europe because of the Bologna process and because of general interest in academic mobility. And Spain has been one of the countries that has been most active in terms of increasing mobility. Spanish students are not only more interested in going outside Spain than they used to be, dramatically so. There's a dramatic change and a dramatic increase in interest in mobility with Spanish students, but also Spain has become and is becoming an increasingly attractive destination for students from the outside because of the increase in interest in the Spanish language, because of the South American countries becoming more economically considered and being emerging economies. And also because of the general interest in the Spanish language, because of the spread of Spanish speakers throughout the world. So Spain, although economically at the moment things are looking quite bad in our country, and I say our country because I identify very closely with it, it is a country with a future and with a very specific context. Because of this increased mobility, it's not good enough, it's not enough for our students now to say that their English is good. It's not enough for our students to say my English is of an advanced level. It's not enough for students now to produce a first certificate which is 10 years old. And until fairly recently, this used to be the case. Now, target universities and businesses wish to have recent certification of the level of language, in this case of English language competence. And you'll know as teachers and learners of languages yourselves how easy it is for your level of language to go down if you don't use it. And you also know how your level of language is susceptible to going up if you practice it and if you keep learning. And we also know that learning a language is a non-stop, continuous, progressive process which never ends and continues all our lives. Even in our own language, we learn more and more vocabulary, more and more ways of speaking. We change the way we speak according to the times. We change the way we speak according to the context. And nowadays, it's important to be able to show what your level of language is. So let's have a little look at English today. This is something that I think is talked about a lot, the role of English today, the importance of English. Nowadays, there are more and more people learning English than ever before. And the globalization of the world is driving the English language learning. Because of globalization, people are finding that they need to be able to speak English in order to be able to operate in any context whatsoever, be it an academic context or a business context. It's important to be able to learn, to be able to use English in any of these contexts. It's also key to attracting foreign investment because of the nature, because of the globality of the use of English and because of the English as a lingua franca. Then in order to attract investment, a country needs to be able to present itself as having skills which are usable. So it's very important for a country to be able to present a reasonable level, or a company to be able to present a reasonable level of English language competence, in the same way that it's important in every walk of life for a student to be able to have a reasonable or adequate level of English. And it doesn't matter what academic discipline they're in, be it medicine, architecture, business of any kind, engineering. It's almost as if English is now a skill as opposed to a language, a skill which is integrated into all other aspects of their professional careers and of their academic careers. So English attracts. It also spreads innovation, because naturally, if we have a world language, a lingua franca, which everyone uses to communicate, then with the language is spread innovation, ideas are spread. So it really is important. And it's more important, I think, than very often our students initially realize. Obviously, it's very difficult to tell a young child, or to instruct a young child, and convince them of the importance of English as a world language, because they're too little. But even our university students and university teaching staff, I sometimes think that they don't realize the extent to which it's important to have English as a skill. If you have a good level of English and you're a practicing professional, your professional chances are going to be always much more attractive if you, on top of it, you have the English language as one of your key skills. And as I said right at the beginning, measuring that level is important, and it's becoming more and more important as time goes on. This is a database of language competency that was carried out by English First, the English First company. And I'd just like to call your attention to this list. Very high proficiency, I think, is possibly predictable that this is Norway, Netherlands, the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden and Finland. And then high proficiency, we have Austria, Belgium, Germany, Malaysia, and I think this also is probably fairly predictable. Obviously, not every country in the world is included in this, but these, amongst other countries, were included in this study, in this database. Exactly how this was carried out, I won't go into, mainly because I'm not exactly sure of the detail of how it was carried out. But if we look at moderate proficiency, we have Hong Kong, South Korea, Japan, Portugal higher, as you can see, higher than Spain, Argentina, France, Mexico, Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia. And way down here in the low proficiency, we have Costa Rica, Italy, Spain, Taiwan, Saudi Arabia, Guatemala, El Salvador, India. Maybe a surprise there, but there are a lot of inhabitants in India, and a lot of people have brilliant C2 native speaker, very sophisticated English language level, but a lot of people do not. And China, Brazil, Russia, these four are very powerfully emerging economies. And consequently, one of the first things they are obviously going to have to do in order to keep pushing their emerging economy is getting their English up to a level which will support that growth. And what is Spain doing here, we might ask? It is very important for any country that needs to develop and wishes to develop in the modern world. It is very important for that country to have a reasonable language level in order to support that. So I don't know if you're very surprised by this chart. Are there any surprises in there, do you think? Or does it match up to the concept you have of how countries manifest their language capacity? Okay, so no real surprises there. English study. Let's look a little bit at English study the world over. English belongs to non-natives. I think we know this from how the world functions and how languages, how the influence of language is so great over the world. English does belong to non-natives, and there are whole schools of thought about whether the certain versions of the language will actually become other languages, etc. But it certainly belongs to non-natives. I don't know if you've ever observed a meeting in which you have a number of non-native English speakers and a couple of native English speakers. There's often an information gap between those native speakers and those non-native speakers, because the native speakers don't speak the version, the international English language version of the meeting. So there can be information gaps there, and there can be miscommunication, and there can be difficulties, whereas where the non-native speakers understand each other perfectly and have a certain type of language, it'll often be the case that native speakers do not adapt well to the language of the meeting, and they continue to use colloquial expressions or local expressions or maybe old-fashioned expressions, and then the non-native speakers don't quite get what they're talking about, and there is something of a mismatch. I've seen this happen quite often. It's quite an interesting thing to observe. And then we have all the myths in the learning process, which as teachers you must be aware of. Like, you can only learn a language if you start young. It's much more difficult to speak than it is to do anything else. If you start when you're older, there's no way you'll be able to learn a language. You have to go and live in the country in order to learn a language. All these myths that we grow up with, which we as teachers know are simply not true. Myths and obsessions. And then there are myths about language and identity. You know, sometimes we find people actually being socially against the existence of a language for political reasons or for reasons of identity. Language is a very sensitive subject, as we know. Living in Spain, local languages and regional language are sensitive, and they're politically sensitive because they have to do with identity, and they have to do with how we function, how Spain functions as a country. So it's always, when we talk about language, it's always a very sensitive area. And sometimes we find people who believe that the existence of one language automatically eliminates the existence of another language, and the fact that English is a global language is the sole reason for language death in the rest of the world. Whereas I think in Spain you say el saber no ocupa lugar, you know, that if you know something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it pushes something else out of your head. And in a way, if we look at languages as being representative of the identity of the people who speak them, with social and political change, language shift is inevitable. It's as inevitable as life and death. So there's a lot of myth about, oh, I don't want to speak English because that means my identity is no longer as Spanish as I want to feel. So this again is something which you may think applies or not to your context or the context of your students, but it certainly applies to some attitudes. And these myths often explain the resistance to learning languages, and not just English now, but majority languages are often resisted for reasons of identity. When you learn a language, this again is something else which I think we need to, and I think we're quite bad as teachers at explaining to our students how long it takes. It's very difficult to strike the balance between informing our students of how long it takes to become competent in a language, but also actually how easy it is. It doesn't take long to take off in a language, but it does take a long time to become highly proficient in a language. So there's a lot of myth around the actual learning process, I think. But in terms of a policy, of linguistic policy in countries, results are slow to emerge. It takes a long time for a generation to filter through. It will take a long time for children in bilingual schools to actually get to the level and grow up with a language and have that level of language competence that we expect of them. And often we can be very impatient. Or how is it possible? You hear parents say, how is it possible that my child's been learning language for a year, learning English for a year, and I try to talk to him about something at the table the other day and the child didn't know any English. You know, the kind of thing that I guess you must hear a lot. You know, where are the results? The results, whilst possible, are slow. It takes a while for linguistic policy to filter through. In the whole world, the privatization of English language provision is a fact of life. It is huge business. It's huge business. It's big business for the British Council. It's big business for examination boards. It's big business for all of us. We all work in the field of language teaching and learning, and consequently is very important to us. As well as being important to the world, it's very important to us that the business works well. Across the board, and particularly across Spain, there is, which is what I know vaguely about, I know something about the need for standardization. We're all working now with the concepts of the Common European Framework quite firmly fixed in our minds, but it takes a long time for these views to filter through to teachers and to filter the understanding of the meaning of standardization and the importance of standardization. It takes a long time, and it has taken a long time for the Common European Framework to actually filter through to our practice and filter through to our understanding of language learning. And at the bottom here I've put EAS, which is English as a skill. Let's move on a little bit. Let's talk about Spain now and have a little look at the economy. I am no economist. I have to say before we even start on this little bit here. You don't need to be an economist to know that at the moment we are in the middle of a recession. Hopefully it would be nice to be at the end of the recession, but we are in the middle of a recession. And the previous growth in Spain, we had a period of growth and development, but it was based on this awful housing bubble, and as tends to happen with bubbles, it burst. And the general commercial activity in Spain tends to depend on domestic demand. Also depends largely on exporting to these three countries: France, Portugal, and Germany. So no big growth or big developments in exporting to growing and emerging economies. The large source, if Spain is to develop out of this situation, obviously there need to be political changes and an investment in growth, but where the growth is in extra-European markets as well as being in Europe, but the growth is outside Europe to these emerging economies. Brazil, all the South American countries, China, India, Russia. So in order to develop international trade with these emerging economies, Spain needs to make sure that this development in English language competence continues and becomes consolidated. A word here about the United Kingdom, which is a country that is seems to be particularly resistant to learning other languages, because they tend wrongly to think, I think business people tend wrongly to think that because they speak the global lingua franca, then they have nothing to gain by learning other languages. But we know that learning another language, even if your language competence is not very high, the empathy that can be established between two people of different cultures is hugely influential on the relations that you have with that person. And there have been several recent studies in which business people in the UK are realizing that they are in fact losing business opportunities because of their lack of ability to speak in another language. There was one particular study in which was reported by Ian Tudor, in which they examined the attitude to foreign language in Scottish business people. And the upshot of this research, one of the results of this research indicated that the business people thought that they'd probably lost something like 40% of their business opportunity because of their inability to be able to empathize and to understand all those nuances of communication that go with language competency, with other language competencies. Because when you learn another language, you don't just learn the language, do you? You learn how people think, you learn how people feel, you learn to recognize those moments in which you are empathizing, which vary from culture to culture. So it is massively important to be able to have access to those, to that knowledge through foreign language learning. So going back to Spain, it's clear the importance of learning the English language as much as in as many walks of life as possible is clear. Let's have a quick look at, I mentioned at the beginning the increase in academic mobility, and we have the Bologna process, the process in European universities, which would imply the need for foreign language acquisition, and B1 is established as a benchmark for graduates. 100,000 Spanish students study English abroad per year, and 150,000 students have had Ministry of Education grants in order to do this. 23% of the Spanish population say they speak English well, and 63% say they don't speak English at all. And we know there's bilingual projects in place. There are changes in linguistic policy in Spain which indicate the importance that both regional governments and national governments give to English language acquisition. But these are kids, and it will take a while for these measures to filter through. And let's look at English at work now, as things are. 70% of senior managers don't speak English, and 40% of them have felt disadvantaged. 17% of our workforce actually works in the tourist industry. 40% of adults believe that English is important, and 6% are studying English. So thinking about the need for language learning amongst adults and all those myths that I mentioned at the beginning, it would seem important that the adult population should also consider the possibility not only of learning English, but also of establishing their level, of knowing what their level is in order to be able to progress, of knowing their level in order to be able to show that they have a specific level of English for their own professional development. But we've also seen that it's not just individuals' professional development that is concerned, but it's also the development of the country. If the country is going to evolve in terms of economic development, in terms of export, generally in professional terms, then it's important to not only to get those skills, that English is a skill, up to the necessary level, but also to be able to measure it. And that is the background to the new test that the British Council has just launched. Now I'm going to ask you to do something. You're all teachers, I take it. And I'd just like to ask you to get to talk to the person next to you about reasons for testing. Why do you test? Just a couple of minutes together. Why do you test? I presume you all test. Why? A couple of minutes together to think about this? Or a minute? Okay, let's hear your ideas. Why do we test as teachers? Why do we test? What have you've been talking about? I know you've been talking. Can you tell me what you've been talking about? Why do you test?
So people know how they're doing, so they know how they're doing, the students, and the
Yeah.
teacher knows how they're doing.
Yes.
How to motivate them.
Yes.
For themselves.
Yes.
Particular people, it's really motivating to
Mm-hmm.
test. And
Yes.
to be able to have standardisation and see how you're doing in comparison to
Mm-hmm.
people.
Yes. It's so that they know how they're doing. I think you've summed practically all the reasons up there. So that they know how they're doing, so that you know how they're doing, so that they feel motivated. And does your testing have an effect on the way you teach? I think what happens with testing is you have washback. So if you give your class a test on whatever it is you've been teaching, whatever aspect of language learning you've been teaching, be it vocabulary or, I don't know, reading skills or speaking skills, if you've tested them on it, then the information that you get from that testing has an immediate and I think quite important effect on how you proceed. Because if you see that your kids just haven't got it, and that when you've provided them with a test, the results have been disastrous in the sense that you see that they haven't actually learned what you expected them to learn, then that's going to make you think about the way you teach, the way you have taught that particular aspect of language, and it naturally affects the way you go forward. So testing is really useful. I mean, you might, the title of my talk is an exciting new test. I think, or an exciting new exam. I think exciting test doesn't really collocate very well, does it? It's something of an oxymoron. You know, how can a test be exciting? Well, it isn't exciting, but it can be extremely informative. It's not particularly exciting for kids to do, although there are tests that kids love doing. But let's think of a test that adults like doing. It's not really a particularly attractive proposition for adults to do a test, but it is incredibly useful. If an adult views a test as being to find out what they don't know, then that makes adults fairly resistant to do tests. Having taught with the British Council in the University of Alcalá, a programme for teachers, an English language programme for teachers, and also an English language programme for the students in the university, it wasn't unusual to find that on the day of the test or on the day of the exam suddenly your class was a little bit smaller than it was normally, because people actually don't like being tested, because they feel that they're going to make themselves look ridiculous and show up what they don't know. And in a way, that can be the fault of an attitude, both shared by teachers and students. So the more imaginative and the more open we can be about the role of testing, I think, the better. So I think in this room we have it fairly clear the advantages of testing. Disadvantages of testing, well, we just identified one, didn't we, with the resistant older person not particularly wanting to go through a process that they usually associate with kids. What other disadvantages are there to applying a test? What can go wrong? What can go wrong with a test, or an exam for that matter? As a teacher, if you administer your own test, what can go wrong?
The test itself.
Sorry?
The test itself can go wrong.
The test itself can go wrong, yes. In what way can it go wrong? In what way can it be wrong?
You haven't planned it properly.
Yes.
You haven't planned the outcomes.
Yes.
According to your teacher.
Yes. That sort of thing, yes, that it doesn't serve the purpose that you intended it to have, that you didn't measure properly how to measure what it was you wanted to find out, that kind of thing. And it can give you the wrong information or give you no information at all. So it's important for a test to be fit for purpose, you know, that you want to test. Let's talk in very old-fashioned terms. If you want to test the uses of the present continuous, then your test needs to address exactly that, the uses of the present continuous, and not the uses of the past perfect or the future, putting it simply. Or if you want to test someone's ability to talk about themselves, then you have to ask them about themselves. You can't be asking them about the role of technology in teaching and learning. So it has to be very specifically designed for very specific purposes. Here we have the Common European Framework that I think represents how the Common European Framework is thought out, because the higher the language level, the broader the language level. And in fact, to talk in levels at all can sometimes be misleading. I'm not sure about maths or physics or science or anything. I would suspect that actually to measure any learning in terms of lines is something of a challenge. But very specifically, in terms of a language, how do we measure a language? And I think the difficulty that sometimes the Common European Framework has found when being rolled out to teachers and learners in general is that difficulty to impose a specific linear structure on a language, because a language is a very organic thing, and suddenly you can do something that you didn't even know you were going to be able to do the day before. You know that feeling that you get round about here? You know, this sort of an area, and suddenly, oh my goodness, I understand everything. I was listening to the radio today, and yesterday I understood nothing, and now I understand everything. That kind of breakthrough moment. It can happen to different people in different ways, and some people can achieve it through employing certain strategies, other people by employing certain other strategies. So it is a kind of a dodgy business, I always think, language measuring. To measure a language competence is dodgy. It's a little bit dodgy in our own language as well, because some people are great at talking. I mean, some people are interesting and eloquent and articulate, and they are great talkers. Other people are equally intelligent, and they are great, and they have an equally great command of the language, but they are much better in writing. And some people are good at that meta-language that is mathematics. language and communication is such a difficult thing to get into a shape, anything remotely approaching straight lines. I mean, even this is a strange way, I guess, of looking at it. But you see, as you can see, C2 is enormous. I think there are plans to divide C2 up because language goes on and on. I mean, it could go up right up there, couldn't it? The ability to use language and the amount of vocabulary and how much that can vary from one. You see it with politicians. You sometimes have very gifted politicians that are brilliant at communicating. In the maybe older politicians with rhetoric had an ability to convince a crowd that now with our technocrats, you know, with our technocrat politicians who tend to just say the same thing over and over again, we don't see. But what I'm trying to say here is that to measure any language competence at all is a tall order. It's a difficult thing to do. And it will almost always, in fact, I would say it always has faults and difficulties. Okay. If we have the Common European Way framework as with its descriptors of what constitutes this level or that level, this is helpful to us as teachers because it establishes standards. Now we know what a B1 is. If I say to you, oh, I have a student and I think he's about B1, maybe B1-2 going up to B2, you know what I mean. Whereas before, when we used the pre-intermediate, intermediate, it wasn't quite as clear. Why is it clearer now? I think, you may not agree, but I think it's clearer now because what we describe is what the student can do, what the speaker can do, or the writer or the learner can do in the language, as opposed to the curriculum that the student has studied. You know, the student has done the irregular past, and it doesn't really mean a thing. Whereas if you say this student can talk about what happened yesterday, that speaks volumes. So these standards, the structure that the Common European Framework gives us has an influence on our standards and on how we deliver. Because what we're delivering now is we're trying to get our students to be able to do things, not to know things. To be able to do this and to be able to do that, rather than to know a long list of phrasal verbs. And students often know a long list of phrasal verbs, longer than even a native speaker, but they won't know how to use it. Okay, so it influences what we teach in terms of the curriculum, how we teach in terms of delivery, and how we assess, how we do our tests, how we construct our tests. And these three aspects should be linked together. And in our schools, that's why we have programs. In our language institutions, that's why we have programs. That's why we think about it. We think about how and what we're teaching and for what purpose and how to test that teaching. What is Aptis? Now, this is getting to what I initially started off when I started to put this presentation together. My purpose was to tell you about this test. It is another test. It's global. It's a global English test developed by the British Council, so not with another examination board. It's a proficiency test for adults or young people over 16. It's informed by current research in applied linguistics, so it corresponds to, it reflects methodology that's used. It's straightforward to access, to manage and to sit. It tests 4 skills and can test them not only together but also on an individual basis. So the test there's the option of testing speaking if that's what you need to test, what a company needs to test. It's flexible, it can be customized. It will not be sold to individuals, it'll be sold to organizations, it'll be sold mainly in the world of work. So it's a business-to-business sale. So it won't be that you can go along and sign up and do the test. It'll be that an organization decides to establish the test in their company, to do a linguistic audit or something like that. It's low to medium stakes, so it's not an international exam. It will not be recognised from one country to another, because for the most part it will be customised in company. And it'll be delivered by computer, telephone, pen and paper, and the results will be available in 24 hours. It's divided into components, as I mentioned. There are 15 different packages. There's a core grammar and vocabulary component which fixes the skills components, gives them more validity and makes them more reliable because of they're aligned with a grammar and vocabulary test. So institutions can decide which component, institutions or schools, but mostly it'll be companies, I would think. So the institutions choose when and how to test. So my purpose here is just to present this test to you in a context. Computer and online, pen and paper on the telephone, so it can be, the speaking component can be obviously can be delivered on the phone. Each skill can be taken via 2 delivery modes. There's a pen and paper version of the test as well. It can be delivered by the company or by the institution or by the British Council. Uses a revolutionary interactive test development, delivery and reporting platform. I translate that into English, which means it has a platform which you download onto a computer, unlock, do the test, and then the results go immediately to be evaluated. Mapped to the Common European Framework, and there's a scale score for grammar and vocabulary, as I mentioned. The scaled score goes up to C. It doesn't differentiate beyond the level C, so it will establish the fact that in the case that the candidate does reach that level, that it's a C level, but it doesn't differentiate between C1 and C2. Its good area is around B1, B2, where it differentiates particularly well. You can get individual and group scores. We think it's accurate. What's it for? It's for benchmarking, it's for audits, it's for filtering. It's not for going and studying abroad. It's not for that. It's for something very, very in-house, I think you might say. It's for identifying students for study, for finding out strengths and weaknesses in a given group, as we just mentioned. Commercial corporations, government ministries. So it's, as I say, it's a business-to-business test. Why? High quality, mix and match, flexible, joint branding and local. So if a company wishes to take ownership of the certificate and wishes to certify themselves, they can do so. Content can be adapted depending on what the target institution is interested in. It's affordable, it's relatively cheap by comparison to other exams in the field. And that is the end of my presentation. It was applied in Kosovo, and they were in the process of, as you can see here, of recruiting new diplomats and consular staff, so they needed to test a lot of people very quickly, so they used this test. This is the kind of purpose for which Aptis was designed. So thank you very much for coming to an probably not very exciting presentation, given the exams are what they are. But thank you very much. Thanks.